All right, so today is Wednesday, February 7, 2018. This is the meeting of the Kubernetes CSI implementation group. Please feel free to add anything to the agenda as we go along. Before we begin, Chakri, do you want to discuss the topic from the last meeting real quick? The probe versus the discovery of what volume plugins advertise and all of that?
Yeah, actually, let's do that. Actually, there is a lot of confusion because I think it's going in totally different directions, and there is no concrete workflow which I'm saying. Because if I say X, people will point Y, but Y index doesn't get together well. So there is no concrete workflow, right? So the question I had was, why will a controller just say that I have a service ready, okay, before it's actually being set up by itself? There is no information that's getting passed in a probe call. No new information. Sorry, I'm in noise here. Give me a couple of minutes.
Sorry, so repeat that again. I missed it.
Yeah. So there is no new information getting called in the probe. Is there a new information?
You're assuming if the probe is consolidated or like separate?
Irrespective of it, right? There is no new information getting passed in the probe. When no information is not passed in the probe, why is the plugin waiting to initialize itself?
Yeah.
And if it cannot initialize, why can't it say that, okay, I don't have a service ready?
I think Andrew's argument is that the plugin doesn't necessarily know how it's running, right? It can run in either controller or node or both, and it doesn't do any special initialization. It just starts up and says, I know how to do all of these things. If the controller calls me to do node stuff, I'll do node stuff. If the controller calls me to do controller stuff, I'll do controller stuff. And if it calls me to do probe, I need to know what am I running as so that I can do the appropriate tests. So I guess is that the plugin doesn't know what it is running as, potentially.
So, okay, so now in that case, is it going to work with all the deployment models which is specified in the CSI spec? We have a controller, centralized controller versus the identity services.
Yep.
And we have one mode where both are clubbed together.
Yep. I think it would, because even this dumb plugin that doesn't know how it's running, the person who is deploying it can deploy it however they want, right? They could put it in headless mode. They could put it in controller mode. Whatever mode that they deploy it in, this plugin is dumb. It'll just accept the commands and handle them. The only thing where it gets tricky is the probe call, because if we consolidate the probe call, it's not going to be able to differentiate between, like, it doesn't know what it's supposed to be running as. Now, you can point out, like, should the plugin be allowed to be that dumb? Like, should it just not know what it's running as? The problem is that the spec itself doesn't dictate that, right? So it leaves it open. And so therefore somebody could implement a plugin that does that.
But I think that's okay if the plugin, if the spec doesn't go into that kind of detail, because
I think that was kind of on purpose, is we didn't want to deploy, we didn't want to specify packaging or deployment stuff.
Right.
But in this case, it's it like intersects, right? A plugin must necessarily know how it is deployed as controller or node or whatever, if we are going to have a common probe call. If the probe call doesn't say probe node or probe controller, it's just probe, then the plugin
that's
needs
perfect. That's perfect. I agree with the argument. Actually, it's a valid point. So now, is that part of identity service, or is it part of a controller service? If it's part of a controller service, right, then it's a chicken and egg, right? Now
right. So I think today it's two separate calls. One is part of the one is part of the controller service. One is part of the node service. And the PR that James has out is attempting to consolidate both of them into a single identity service call, and that's where the controversy is.
If we agree that we need a controller service and a node service calls, right? Let's say that, because actually Andrew has a valid point saying that, okay, I don't know the identity of my plugin, so I can run it as the way I want it. But now, if I include it as a controller service, the plugin first has to say, I'm going to run a controller service. But plugin has not been probed for the controller service. How is it running a controller service?
Well, I think that's the point where that was made is that
So
I think Brad was making that point is that the controller or the plugin should know what its capabilities are.
Okay, then that contradicts the previous argument, right?
Right. So let's assume that the plugin is really dumb and it doesn't, right? Because that's what makes everything so tricky. Because if the plugin knew, it would be simple. So because the spec doesn't require the plugin to know, the plugin can be super dumb and it doesn't know. So in the case of having separate probe controller and probe node calls, it can implement the logic for both. It knows that if I am running as node, these are the checks I need to do. If I am running as controller, these are the checks I need to do. It implements both of them, and then it depends on the CO to call them correctly.
No, I agree with that. Let's take two calls, right? Controller probe is there, node probe is there. I have both the calls. The question is, are the calls should be part of identity service or the calls should be part of the controller service?
Ah, that's a very good point. So assuming that the CO knows which one it is supposed to call, like it knows that the plugin is deployed as controller or node, then it makes sense to just keep those calls in controller and node service.
But I'll throw this out too, is if it's up to the CO to know, then we have a tight coupling.
Yes.
The implementation of what the driver is delivering and what the CO should know about that driver. Whereas
which brings us to the other question which was discussed, which was around what if the plugin doesn't want to have a controller service at all?
Right. And the CO is expecting it to.
Right.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. So I think it hints back to what Chakri was saying, which is the identity service needs to be able to disambiguate, right? Like, but in order for the identity service to disambiguate, these plugin itself needs to know what its capabilities are. So what we need to do is enumerate.
So there are two workflows, right? I just want to make it a little bit. I want to understand from my understanding. There are two workflows. The first workflow is I have identity service. The identity service has a controller probe and a node probe.
Yep.
And I call the controller probe as a plugin implementer. I will get the call. I will do all my installation. Then I start the controller service. I cannot start a controller service without initializing myself, right? So, and I have the node service, and I get a node probe. Then I initialize everything for my node stuff, and I start the node service.
Hold on, sorry. Can you clarify who's calling what in this scenario?
The CEO first initially calls the identity service. It gets to get supported versions, everything. The next call it makes as part of the identity service is start a controller probe because it expects a controller.
Okay.
And the plugin, because of the probe, it gets it. Now it sees that, I know that I'm getting a controller probe. I need to instantiate myself a controller service because I have the capability.
I see. So you're saying that the purpose of probe is not just to run, a deployment test, but it's also to initialize the plugin.
Yes, that's what I've been hearing, right? People are saying that I have the capability, but I don't know which mode I'm running in. The moment I got a probe, I'm going to initialize myself.
Oh, no. So I think what people are saying is that it doesn't initialize itself to run as one or the other. It initializes itself to run as both.
No, but then how do you can initialize yourself as a service, and then the moment you get a probe, you reinitialize yourself, right?
So that's like this whole thing is kind of hypothetical. It's assuming that the plugin itself is very, very dumb, and it doesn't do any special initialization, basically.
Yes. And I don't want, if I have 10 plugins, I don't want all of them to be.
I like it. Like thinking about being able to initialize a plugin through the CSI interface, whether that is something we should support or not.
Yes.
I feel like we should not. I feel like initialization and how a plugin runs should be determined by the author and the deployment.
Yes.
And if we go down that path, the problem is we never specified what that looks like, so we can't make the assumption that the plugin knows that it exists.
Actually, even though we don't specify it in the spec, we have it clearly documented, saying that, okay, in one mode is you don't have a headless mode, where you have controller and identity service. You expect both of them to run on all the nodes, on all the plugins. And you have a centralized controller mode. That means you're already kind of giving them an option to pick one or the other model.
So we said that the plugin should be able to be deployed in these modes. We never stipulated that the plugin must know that it is running in this mode, right? There's a difference between must be able to run and, answer calls versus it must know what mode it is running in to be able to make some decisions.
The moment you're in the deployment in this mode, then you're expecting it to do a controller service. It are kind of the deployment mode already knows that it has to run in particular mode, right?
I think that's the assumption, but the problem is the the spec doesn't like dictate that. I think
you don't dictate it. I agree.
It might be saying.
I was going to ask, do we need a PR that says the spec should be updated to expect a driver to know what mode it's supposed to be in? Would that make a lot of this go away?
Yes, it would. I think that's one option.
But again, the question I had was, what is the probe is supposed to do? Like, is the probe is going to start a controller service after the probe call? Or we expect every plugin to run always a controller and identity service. The moment I get a probe, I reinitialize myself.
So I think let's clean this all up. The initialization should not happen by the probe. The purpose of the probe call is not initialization. It's just dumb deployment verification. It's just saying everything inside me is as expected. All my dependencies are there. So it's not actionable. It's just a health check.
The way I see it is,
let me hold on. Let me just. I understand where Shakir is coming from. Let me try to see if I can say it another way. If there was no probe call at all, then the driver still needs to initialize and check if the system is okay.
Yeah.
I think what the probe call can do is it can later say, it can give the status of that initialization that it did already. It can say, yes, everything's fine because I already checked it.
It's in the name. It's
right.
a probe.
Yeah.
But then the question still remains
that's a health check then.
Sorry. It is a probe health. I mean, I think eventually, after all of this, most implementation will be a health check that says I'm ready. I think because there's too much responsibility, and what we're fighting with right now is the delineation where that responsibility falls, whether it's on the client or the server. The client, the CO, and the server being the driver. So let's just let the driver do most of its work and expect the driver to know what and where it's supposed to be.
I think I agree.
Check, hey, are you ready? I'm ready. Let's go.
So it sounds like what we are in this group agreeing on is that we will leave probe as just a health monitor, and it only needs to be, it can be consolidated into identity. It doesn't need to differentiate between controller or node. It's just probe, do you have what you need? And in order to do this, the spec must be clarified to say that there must be some mechanism by which when deployed, the plugin knows which mode it is running in, and do any initialization that it needs to when it starts, and fail initialization and crash if it doesn't. Right, so we're decoupling initialization from health checking, and we're also saying that in order to do the initialization, the plugin author must expose some way for the deployer to be able to specify what mode it's running in.
We've planned something similar to the Ceph plugin. Basically, when you start the plugin, you can pass a parameter saying it's a controller role or it's a node role or both.
Yes, I like that. That makes sense to me. Now, the only problem with this is, so let's assume that we were able to get this into the CSI spec, is this whole problem of we want controller to be optional. So if a particular plugin does not want to implement the controller at all, and I guess if we leave this as a deployment parameter, it's just a parameter that isn't supported, so the deployer, whoever is deploying it, needs to know that. So I guess that's not a problem.
No.
Yep. And in the probe call, maybe if you want, actually you can extend it in the reply and say that controller service ready and node service ready, if you really need to.
The response, and I don't think it's necessary, but that's an option as well.
Because if you want to check the health check for both the services, you can add it. And
well, I mean, if the plugin already knows what mode it's running in, you're saying that in the response so that it can inform the caller what mode it's running in?
Yeah, no, actually, it might happen that the controller initialization might fail, right? And echoing Luis's statement saying that if it fails, then in the probe call, you can say that controller not ready, and you can have error.
Oh, right. I think the response for the probe already has some, like, you can return an error and just give an arbitrary description to things.
Ah, okay. So in that, we can actually plug both, actually, then.
Yeah, you can say whatever you want. It's like a free-form field, so.
Perfect.
So why are you guys against collapsing it? I know this is where the real meat of the CSI spec happens.
No, I think we just we agree that we want to collapse it now. The crux of the question was, like, if we do the collapsing, the problem is with the fact that the spec itself doesn't dictate that a plugin must know what mode it's running in. It's kind of implied, but it was never dictated. And because it was never dictated, we can't rely on it.
Well, so one benefit that I saw from collapsing it that we would kind of like as a use case is the high availability that I was referring to earlier. And that, you know, a controller could fail, you know, your single controller could fail and maybe something else on another node could pick up. Right? And if you force there only to be a controller or a node concept, you know, either or, and one can't convert to the one or the other, it doesn't work so well. But if it can, and it's just capabilities based, the solution.
Yeah, and I mean, so truthfully, you could still do that without this change. For example, you already have the way that we're deploying it on Kubernetes, we expect an instance to be deployed on every node. Each one of those instances is expected to run as a node, and then we deploy one separate instance for the controller. You could imagine coupling all of that into a single pod, where you have every plugin container knows how to do both controller and node, and then the sidecar containers decide which one is going to be acting as the current leader. So you could have some sort of leader election protocol between the sidecar.
Well, there might not just be one controller. I mean, if you're looking at a federated environment where, you know, you multi-zone AWS, you might have a different controller for each different zone.
And that's fine. Like, that just means you need to run separate instances of these things.
Right.
So I think that's possible just using the sidecar containers that we have today. But it might be simplified by this. I'm not sure.
Now's the time to simplify, right? Once it goes...
Right.
Absolutely. So I think we're in agreement within this group that what we would like to do is consolidate probe into a single call, and also dictate in the spec that that the plugin must have some way to know which mode it's deployed as.
Yes, and when we are having the conversation, right, most of the time it's jumping between these models. Because of it, it's very tricky to follow through one model, right? Because if you go through one model, the second one doesn't work, but we know that, but we cannot point to the second models, which doesn't work to the first model. So we are kind of like a mixing and maxing both the models. And
the only drawback of this is that we basically fix the mode that it runs in at deployment time, right? What this means is that after a volume plugin is running, it can't change its mode or like get initialized to something else while it's running. It needs to be decided when it's.
Wait, why is that? I don't see why that's has to be.
So if you dictate that the volume plugin needs to know what mode it's running in, the assumption, I guess, is that that is going to be set when it is deployed. I guess you're right. If we write the spec in such a way to say that the volume plugin needs to know what mode it's running in, it doesn't dictate strictly that it has to be set at initial, like when the plugin is deployed. Theoretically, you could have some other way to be able to switch modes while it's running.
It's all up to the implementation. I mean, if I was implementing this, I'd put in my CFG file, you know, which mode the plugin's running.
Yeah. Okay, I think that seems reasonable to me then. Let's push that forward. Sorry for wasting this meeting to discuss that. I'll reply offline on that thread, and we'll push that forward and hopefully get clarification. We have 5 minutes left in this meeting. Are there things that people want to talk about?
I had something.
Please.
a big something. All right. So snapshots is something that we've been talking about doing. We had that call 2 weeks ago, and we said that we were going to do it through CSI.
Yeah.
It has made me think that there's kind of a broader feature here in the different storage platforms have different capabilities, which was touched on earlier. And they also have different features, and we can't possibly legislate that all through API, right? Like Cluster has geo-replication. Nobody wants geo-replication in the SIG spec.
Yeah.
Right. So we need some kind of generic capabilities caller, some way to, generically call capabilities that are unique to different storage vendors. Yeah. And I think Snapshot's beginning to touch on that. It's leaving the mount, unmount, attach, detach, the well-defined contract stuff into features storage platforms have that not everybody does.
Yep.
And that to say, like, I have resources that, that can take this and run it, but I'd rather kind of get a feel for the group on which way they want to go before I kick them off.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting point, and it was something that we had to deal with when we were talking about dynamic provisioning, because all these different systems have a ton of knobs that don't necessarily apply to all of them.
Right.
And the way that we solved that was make provisioning have a generic blob that it takes on the create volume side, and it allows provisioning whatever.
And I think people have been very good with that too. It wasn't. I don't think it's been abused. I think it worked out pretty well for storage class.
Right. But I think the problem that you're getting at is, okay, I have the ability to set, an arbitrary parameter when I provision, but that information is not necessarily surfaced back in a way that allows arbitrary binding, right? With dynamic provisioning, we assume that the request comes in, we fulfill it, and that's it. But for the static provisioning case, where these volumes exist and they have arbitrary set of abilities that are not currently defined in the PV. Currently PV only has access mode, capacity, and a couple other things. For that static provisioning case, how do we handle it?
Yeah, right. There's properties of volumes that aren't well defined, and there's also actionable things that volumes.
So I think what we decided at the time was to use the storage class as a mechanism by which you could do this, right? So as on your PVC, you slap on I want storage class, whatever the hell you want to call it, and then on your statically provisioned PVs, you use the storage class as some sort of label, right? So if there was some capability that you wanted, like snapshots or something, you could create a snapshots class, and then the binder would only bind to those.
Well, what I'm getting at is the problem's a little bit higher level here, because we have snapshots, we have geo-replication, we have restore snapshot, we have, backup.
Yep.
There's all these different functions that we want to implement into the CSI driver that don't make sense in the spec. Right, it's not universal.
So let's talk about each one of them individually, because I don't think they necessarily all apply. How about I ask it this way? Are there any of these features that you cannot set in the create volume call?
You cannot set snapshot. Take snapshot.
Sure. Okay. So snapshot is just another ability of a controller. So what is it? So what flow do you want to see that is not going to work?
Well, there's no API call for create snapshot.
Let's imagine there's a create snapshot call in the future for CSI. We could.
That'd be fine. But what I'm anticipating is, how does it scale? Sure, we had a snapshot API call, but next somebody's going to come in and say, hey, we actually have this cool replication feature that we want an API call for.
So I think the difference here is that the snapshot call necessarily requires extending the interface, because it's not something that is a parameter of an individual volume that you can stuff into the arbitrary create volume call. But for a lot of these things like geo-replication, they're very specific to a volume, and you could just stuff those right down the arbitrary create volume call. I don't know if there's other classes of operations that can't be stuffed into the create volume call and require a separate operation.
Let me just add some context to this. I think that CSI right now, it's trying to keep it as simple as possible, which is just create a volume and then mount it. That's it. Like everything else is just punt on. And I think that the way we do it in Portworx, just to let you know, is that we do snapshots through the create call, because a snapshot is really a new volume. So what we do is that we pass a tag, because it's just a map string of the parent that you're targeting. When we see that parent equals some ID, then we take a snapshot, and then you can mount that, and it just becomes a normal volume through list volumes or anything. So what I'm trying to say is that, the current CSI spec as it is extremely simple. And I think as we start moving to storage management, it could get quite complicated.
Well, so you're saying you're actually doing the same function, but you're sneaking it through the create volume.
Yeah, right? But that's what it's for, right?
No, it's not. And let's break down the CSI spec in this way. The things that go in the CSI spec should be the things that the CO necessarily needs to be able to control. That's the line, right? You don't throw things, if the CO doesn't care about them, if the CO doesn't need to control it, it doesn't need to go into the spec.
Right, but you have to admit that there is a set of imperative functions that the CO does care about, like create snapshot.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why I believe snapshots should be part of this spec, because the orchestration system will necessarily need to be aware of this thing as a first class thing.
But to Luis's, sneaky little create volume call, we could just be done with this all together and have like a execute capability.
The problem is that, like, if the way that Luis is doing it, the CO doesn't know what he's doing. So he needs to build like special functionality that knows that it's talking to the Portworx controller and that it's doing this, right?
Right. What that's all I'm saying is we create a generic interface for the same kind of thing.
As long as the CO knows how to use it, it's okay. But if the CO doesn't know how to use it, then it doesn't make sense in the CSI spec.
Yeah, let me just put it another way. If the tags that are a part of the map string parameters are not standardized, right? They're only there for expansion. So that's why we know, you have a Portworx volume on the other side, and then you want a snapshot. Right. So you send that across. Like it's like how you say, a void pointer,
Yeah, and I mean, if you're going to do that, at that point, you could just extend the CSI spec arbitrarily to just expose extra services. And if you're talking to that CSI plugin, then that's not a problem. The problem is when we're trying to standardize something for a generic plugin, CSI plugin, and a generic CO.
That's a fair point. I mean, it's assuming that you want the function to be completely portable across every provider.
Yep.
Yeah.
But there's just some stuff that I can't see wanting to put in the spec.
Yeah, I completely hear you. And I think as soon as those scenarios get raised, we're going to need to have a discussion on each one of those in the CSI group to discuss, one, does the CO necessarily need to be aware of this ability? Is there any orchestration level stuff that it's going to do? 2, is that going to be common enough across these COs that it requires being part of the spec? And 3, does it apply to enough volume plugins for it to be, be surfaced in the spec? If the question to all of those things is yes, then, it's something we can entertain. Otherwise, I think we have a solid case to push back and say, no, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. So snapshots, Luis, it sounds like you've already been doing some dirty backdoor work on it.
It's not dirty. It's all allowed.
But yeah, snapshots, I think, is a solid case.
So like Luis' case, actually, I know some other storage like that. For them, snapshot is the same as a volume. But most storage that I know treat snapshot differently.
Yeah.
So I think I can understand the case.
Yeah, I understand like that. A snapshot sometimes it's just a new B tree saved. It doesn't have to create a volume out of it.
The only reason it would make sense to introduce it as a separate call is because the CO needs to be able to handle it as something different from a volume. And trying to smash it all through the same call is going to just
with some volume types need. Okay, is there someone spearheading the effort to get it into the spec?
Not that I know of.
Jing, actually.
I'm working on that with Jing. That's decided in that last meeting, right?
Oh, good.
We are drafting it.
Okay, so you do have intention to get it into the spec.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope everybody agrees. I thought we already agreed last time.
The CSI group is very contentious. Good luck.
Okay.
We'll get it in. I think it makes sense.
Well, I hope everybody at SIG Storage at least support this effort.
Yeah. Is there already a PR? Do you know?
There is a PR, but that PR does not have the CSI in it. There is a PR for Snapshot in general.
No, I mean like in the CSI spec, is there a CSI issue? Or?
Not yet. We have not read that yet. So I think let me talk to Jing again, see at what point we will raise it. Yeah, because we are still trying to finalize the spec before we.
If you want help or bouncing it off someone, I have resources that are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me know too.
Great,
Let me know.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure. Yeah.
And maybe it would be a good idea to start a small working group on this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good idea.
I wouldn't invite the entire SIG, and I wouldn't invite the entire CSI working group.
And if nothing else works, you can use your parameters like I do.
Sneak it in somewhere else. So I have a question about snapshotting, because this is not my area of expertise. Wouldn't the CEO? So I'm guessing if we bring snapshotting inside CSI itself, then the CEO would have to know about Snapshot as a first class.
Correct.
As a first class resource, right?
Yep.
Okay. Is that the case today?
With Kubernetes, it requires an external component to be running, an external snapshots controller. If that is running, then yes. Without it, no. And
the desire is yes, though, right? I mean, that's
correct. Exactly.
You guys do that is because they want to roll back to Snapshot or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry to derail this meeting today a little bit. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about? Otherwise, we'll do status updates next meeting on Friday.
I have a small update. Actually, I'll be on vacation, kind of.
Okay.
In India for the next month, but I will be on and off I'll try to make it at least once a week, and if I will ask Shilpa to attend for any of the other updates. Okay.
Okay, and for your deliverables, do you want to give a quick status update or just do it offline? Or
yes, actually, I have only one thing, which is we need to figure out the mode propagation. That's one. Okay. And the other one is the plugin discovery, right?
I forget.
Registration mechanism.
Okay.
Yeah, that is still in flux, right? Vikas, and we are trying to still figure out the best way to do it. Once Vikas is done, I will try to parallelly work in and put a PR.
So we have this allow privilege flag thing. Should we just scratch that for now, or?
You can scratch it for now. When I get a chance, I will do it, and you can mark it green. Otherwise, fine. It's not a must, though.
Yep, agreed. Yeah. And language around probe, we already were working on. And okay, that seems reasonable. There's docs, but yeah, we can find someone else to help with that. Okay, sounds good. Have fun.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for all your input.
Yep, thank you guys.
Hey, Saad, real quick, I'll reach out on Erin says she can meet, and so we can. I want to get us talking about.
Okay. Sounds good to me. I'm having some trouble hearing you. There's wind noise.
No, that's somebody else.
Let me just mute people. But yeah, that sounds good to me. I am free, I believe, this afternoon. Or
tomorrow, so I'll check.
Tomorrow? Okay. Yeah, just ping me on Slack and.
Okay, I'll do.
All right, that's good.
Saad, if you could take another look at that breaking changes in CSI, because I have one proof from I forgot what's his name, so maybe it would be okay, basically to merge it.
Yeah, I pinged G yesterday. Let me double check on that after this meeting and see what the current status of that is. I'd really like to see that go into.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's call it, and we'll see you guys on Friday.
Later.
All right, bye.
Thank you. Bye.